Today, I'm going to be reading a chapter on the endgame, and this one is all about king and a knight versus king and a pawn. All right, so we have white king here, knight here, king here, and a pawn here, white to move. I'll turn that analysis off. So in this position, white is aiming for a draw, because white only has a knight as opposed to a pawn that can become a queen. So the question is, can this knight alone uh, stop this pawn from promoting indefinitely? And let's see. So the only move that doesn't immediately lose for white is to move the knight to d1. So the knight basically just has to keep control of this square at almost all times. Controlling the pawn, basically controlling its advance, is easier if the knight can stand in front of it. Now the knight can maneuver to both sides of the pawn because this is a central pawn. It's a bit trickier if it's, say, a knight pawn or a rook pawn. Say king goes to c2, tries to kick the knight out, but the knight can go to f2. See, the knight still eyes a square, and if the pawn ever just becomes a queen, the knight will just take it, and it's a draw anyway. But this is particularly good because there is a wall between the knight and the king in the form of these two squares, not that one, these two squares, which are attacked by the knight, and the pawn lies on this square. So the king, the black king, cannot go to either of these squares, so he has to go uh, all the way around in order to try to put pressure on the knight again. And say, for each move the black king takes, the white king can just get closer. If the black king comes here, just move the knight in front of the pawn again. This is a check. If the black king comes here, knight goes to b2. Again, there's this wall that the king would have to come back, but now our king comes here and extends the wall. And eventually, our king will simply come here, and if the black king is not eyeing the d1 square, then we can just take. And this is easily a draw. So far, we can conclude that if the knight can stand in front of the pawn, the position is drawn against any of the book says the 4 central files. So any of these central files is easily a draw if the knight can get in front of the pawn. But now here's a question. What if the knight cannot get in front of the pawn, but can control the promotion square? So now we have a new position. Set a position. We have king here, pawn here, a knight here on f4, and the white king's here, white to move. If we can choose, we must control the pawn from the rank, or provide a good idea to control the pawn from the side rather than from the rear. So from here, let's say if the knight comes here to d3, that gives a check and eyes this square, but the black king can come here, both attacks the knight and still eyes this square. All of that, eyeing the square might not be all that relevant. Then, and the knight can't really do too much. If he comes here, the pawn just promotes. So that's not a great move. What about knight to e2 instead of d3? The knight is transferred to a side of the pawn. Transferred. Okay. Say the king goes to d2. Now this knight can go. There's actually a trick here. The knight can go to d4. And the point is, if the pawn promotes, there's this fork attacking both the king and the queen. King moves, and it's a draw. So say king goes back to... Wait. Yeah, no, never mind. Yeah, the book says... It's actually, this is just forcing the draw outright, because if the pawn promotes to queen, again, there's this knight fork, right? But if the king goes anywhere else, the knight just takes the pawn, and it's a draw anyway. So, against a 7th rank pawn on any of the 4 central files, which is C, D, E, and F file, if the knight can stand in front of the pawn, it's a draw. If not, the knight must at least laterally control the promotion square to draw. And laterally is what I just talked about. Being able to... Not that one. Being able to have this little maneuver to... However, there's another thing. What about king to d1 here? The book does cover this. In the case of d1, the knight could get to its ideal square to control the pawn from the other side. So in the case of king d1, the knight can go to play knight c3 check. Say the king goes to d2 now, then the knight goes to a2. And now we control the draw the exact same way as before. Now we have the wall again, and the king has to go around. And once he gets around, once he gets around to either a3 or b3, we just take the knight to c1. He goes here, we go here, and it's the same exact concept as before. However, this is only relevant for the 4 central files. So now let's talk about what if it's a knight's pawn instead. So in the next situation, we have king here, pawn here, knight here, king still here. It is white to move. Actually, no, I'm actually black to move here. So the point is, it's more difficult to draw with the knight because there's less room to move around for the knight. Like in the first example, say if oh, that just never mind. Like say the pawn's here, then the knight can move from here to here to here, and basically just repeat that. Because again, there's this wall here. We could just waste moves with the white king. If the king comes here, take a check, go here, there's plenty of space to move. Mainly these 3 squares is all the knight needs. But in the case like this, and you have to control it laterally, there's still plenty of space for the knight to move. He goes here, he goes here, and again, the pawn, if the pawn promotes, there's this check, which takes the queen. And if the king goes here, the knight goes here, and if the king goes anywhere, we'll say he goes in front, the knight can just come back. The king comes here, the knight just comes back with another check. If the king goes here, the knight can come here with the same setup. Again, this is if the knight's in the middle, it has all the space to move. But when the knight, it's not always a surefire draw if there's not as much space. Say if there's a knight's pawn instead of a central pawn or a bishop's pawn. So from here, it's black to move, and the best move is obviously pawn to b2. And we know that the knight's gonna have a hard time if it cannot stand in front of the pawn, right? So from here, if we try the same thing, try to control it laterally, we can go knight to d2. But now king c1 is actually a lot better, because if the knight comes here, the king goes here, and the knight, there's no square all the way over here for the knight to go to. However, if the king went to c2, then this is the same thing. If the pawn queens, there's this check. So if the king goes to c1, there's nowhere for the knight to go without. I guess the knight can give one check, but he's giving up a. It's the only check the knight has. Well, except for a2, but that's just pawn can just take with and promotes. But the king can go here, so that the knight's now out of checks, and it cannot come back to b1. So, and the pawn will just easily promote. So against a 7th rank pawn on a knight file, so the b file or the g file, if the knight can stand in front of the pawn, it's still a draw. Because again, if we set it up, if the knight can get in front of it, let's say something like this. King goes here. Well, the only move is for the knight to check here. If the king goes here, just do a king move because the knight's still here. But if he goes here, knight can just come back here. If the king comes back, here's a check. When he comes back, he's here. But if he comes here, wait, is this correct? Yeah, knight to b1. Check. Yeah, it's a draw. But this is only if the knight's able to get in front of the pawn. In the other example, where we had like this, again, this doesn't quite work because the knight doesn't have a square over here to either square, and it will just get captured if he gets here. So now the book is going over the concept of a sixth rank rook's pawn. So in this scenario, we have king here, pawn here, and a knight here. White to move. So this is drawable if the knight can get on the circuit, like similar to like a racing circuit. It's more or less if he can get on the right circuit that allows him to basically move in a circle that will either check the black king or control this h2 square, then he's good. So the right move here for white is knight to g4. And the book says apparently knight to c4 draws as well, but won't fall into that. However, knight f3 fails because this is what's considered a bad circuit and it's eventually expelled. So from here, the king can go to g2, knight h4 check, then king f2, and now the knight cannot come back to f3, and the pawn can come forward. So the correct move is knight to g4. This is the right circuit. Let's say king comes to g3, and the knight goes to e3, and the pawn cannot advance because the knight can come to f1 and check the king and the pawn. So knight goes to e3, then after that, if the king goes to f3, the knight can go to f1, eyeing the square. If the king goes to f2, knight goes to h2, and it's just a ring around the rosy. Kind of like that. It goes here, eyeing the square in h2. King comes up to g. If he comes to f3, the knight can just come back to h2 with a check. King goes back to g4. King goes to g3, knight to e3. Pawn cannot advance because the knight can go to g1 and check the king and the pawn. So a knight can draw against a king and a pawn, specifically a pawn on the 6th rank on the edge of the board, if it can stand in front of it in the right circuits. If the knight just controls the pawn's path, it needs to enter the right circuit to draw. That is for the h1 corner. g4, e3, and f1. And technically h2. From the f3 square, the knight fails. It fails if it went to f3 because there's not the right circuit here because there's not enough room. Okay, so now that's a 6th rank rook spawn. What about a 7th rank rook spawn? So we have a king here, pawn here, knight here, king's all the way in the corner. So it's clear that we cannot get to h2 to stop the advance of this pawn. But okay. This looks bad because we cannot get to h2, but this is a draw because the knight can come to g3, pawn goes to h2, but then we bring the king to b7. So actually, this is like the ideal setup because the black king cannot come to any of these squares that I've just highlighted. It cannot come to these squares because the knight attacks it, and it cannot come to these squares because then the knight can come to f1 and fork the king and the pawn. So the king has to go around this wall which takes a lot of time. So say black plays king to d4, king to c6. We just need to bring our king in as close as we can. King to e5, king to c5, king to f4, knight to h1, king f3, king d4, king g2. And this looks bad because this knight can only go to g3 and f2. It's about to be captured, and that's true. But Space Vegetable, welcome in, bro. I appreciate you coming in. King goes to g2, but we just simply bring our king to e3, and if he takes, we have the king goes to f2, and we have a stalemate. Let's see. No, all right. There's another uh diagram. There's another here because I was just going over what the heck. Because I was just going over this. Because it looks like the Black King can just march over, kick the knight out of the way, and the pawn promotes. But there's actually like a bit like a barrier here. Because the knight attacks these two squares, and the king cannot come to either of these two squares, because if he does, say he comes to e3, knight comes to f1 and forks the king on the pawn. So that buys just enough time, uh, like this, for the king to have to go around this wall. It buys just enough time for our king to come in, and by the time he captures the knight, we can stalemate him, like that. But there's another uh, barrier method that the book I'm reading mentions. So I'm going to go over that right now. Knight here, king here, pawn here, so black move. From this position, let's see. I'm just going over reading this as I go, but so if the king comes to d3, the knight can go to g3 with the same barrier concept that I just went over. So he goes to, in this position, the king goes to c2 first. Because yeah, the book is now saying if he went to d3, goes over the same thing. But now apparently the knight comes to g3 instead. Let's see, the king can't come here because of this check. Wait, am I missing something? Oh, wait a minute. So so if king goes to d3, then we have knight g3 with the same barrier. But it's also, if king to d4, then the knight can come to f2, and it's basically the same barrier like this. King can't come here because the knight attacked those squares. The king can't come here because we have this check. But in the original thing, king goes to c2, we bring the knight to g3. King goes to d1, we bring our king to d6, king to e1, king to e5, king to f2, king to f4. It's a drawn game because the king now supports the knight. So when it comes to Yeah, I find it interesting as well. So then the book says the knight alone cannot stop a seventh rank rook's pawn. However, it can set up these barriers and can delay enough moves for you to bring your king in to A this out. Yeah, in a time scramble, I don't know if I would be able to see this, but that's kind of the point of reading up on this stuff. Because if you know it, if you know like this entire chapter deals with a knight versus a pawn endgame, and it's just if the white king was blocked, its technique wouldn't work. Potentially, potentially. Let's see. Say king here. Well, king can't come here because of this one. Let's say, oop, say something like this. Let's say it's something like this. It's white to move. So we have the first barrier that I mentioned, this one, because we have this check on F1 if he comes to E3 or D2. But the black king is cutting off our king. So, but however, I'm just seeing this now. Our king also prevents the black king from coming here, and the knight prevents the black king from coming here. So if it's black's move, I think. No, it's white's move. So say we come here, he can't come here because we have this one. So he has to go up. And if it just becomes a race like this, from here, no. I think that's the point. I think here we just go to H1, then the king comes here. Then we just come to E1 if he comes here, but then he takes the knight, and we stalemate like this. If I set up for it to be black's move, I think I think it's probably even worse because the only move that black has is this one to D4. Then that just gives our king time to come in. Actually, it's more or less the same thing. It's almost the exact same thing. So I don't know if there really is a way for the Black King to shut out our king and pursue the knight at the same time, if that makes sense. Because if you want any chance for this pawn to promote, then you need to chase this knight away. But you cannot simultaneously chase the knight away and keep our king away at the same time, if that makes sense. Let's see. Yes, you're exactly right. If the black king just keeps opposition against the white king, then he cannot challenge the knight to chase him away, and the position's just drawn anyway. But remember, the uh, the position is only drawn if our king has enough time to come in. If the king can has enough, if the black king has enough time to chase the knight away, and our king is not close enough, then the pawn promotes. It mentions a king plus knight checkmate, and the position it says. So we've got a pawn on a3, king on a1, king on c2, and a knight on e3, white to move. So from here, the was actually quite simple. The knight just comes to c1, and the only uh, legal move for black is to come to a2, and this is checkmate. So this is like probably a corner case scenario. But typically, if you have a pawn here, what's more likely going to happen is you're going to have to, if you can get in the right circuit, you can draw if the pawn's still on the sixth ring, but if it reaches the seventh, you need to try to form that barrier in the middle. But however, that barrier only works if the black king is away from his pawn. If you take this scenario and just move our king, say, over here, then I'm pretty sure this just wins for black. Like black could just come here, and it's white to move. Say, bring the king over, king goes here. You can't really set up many checks. The only check you can set up with the knight is moving to f4, but a2, give a check here, but you can't even get to a1. The king moves wherever, and so you can, and you got a queen. So if the pawn comes to on the seventh rank, you can only have chances to draw for the most part if the black king is away from his pawn. But this thing, again, in this corner case scenario, there's a force mate too. And there's another one that my book refers to as the dumb knight square. And the dumb square, I'm pretty sure, is one of these squares. So b2, b7, g2, g7. We have a king here, and our king's way out, like this. White to move. So in this, even the book refers to this as an extreme case. The knight occupies the worst square that we can find, which is b7. Not only does the knight not stop the pawn, it also prevents the black king from doing something. So pawn can go to a6. If the king goes to c8, pawn can go to a7. Blocks this square and can just queen. But if we come to here, we take a move to move the knight, but then it's already too late.